You can't have the last mile without the middle mile. It is necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient.
This is episode 214 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. Welcome, I'm Lisa Gonzalez. Which is more likely to bring better connectivity to a larger section of the community, middle mile or last mile infrastructure investment? Both are necessary, and while there are those who believe middle mile investment inspires private providers to deploy their own last mile infrastructure, that theory has yet to be proven. On the other hand, last mile connectivity depends on solid middle mile infrastructure to connect a local community to the outside world. This week, Chris talks with someone who has expertise with both. Fletcher Kittredge, CEO of GWI, has developed projects that involve middle and last mile connectivity. He and Chris discuss a range of issues, including where limited dollars should be focused when both last and middle mile infrastructure needs developing. Learn more about the company at gwi.net and read more about Maine's three-ring binder project at the muninetworks.org tag, 3-ring binder. Now here are Chris and Fletcher Kittredge, CEO of GWI, to talk about middle mile and last mile deployment.
Welcome to another edition of the Community Broadband Bits podcast. I'm Chris Mitchell, and today I'm speaking with Fletcher Kittredge, the CEO of GWI in Maine. Welcome to the show.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Fletcher, it's great to have you back again. You've been on, I think, twice before, maybe just once, but you and I have talked many times, and I think we'll call this our middle mile versus last mile show, in which we talk about some of the tensions, I think, between where to invest to spur better internet access. To start, I thought we would ask you to just tell us a little bit about the three-ring binder approach in Maine and your role within that.
The three-ring binder is an 1,100-mile, very high-capacity dark fiber middle-mile network that's built throughout the state of Maine. And it goes primarily in rural Maine, though it touches urban Maine too. And it's in the form of three large fiber rings that go around the state in the rural areas. And it's dark fiber, which means there's no lit service. It makes it possible for carriers to provide service, but it requires carriers to do it. And it's open access.
You said it requires carriers to do it. I think, is that just to distinguish that if I owned a business selling widgets, I myself would not be able to buy dark fiber off the three-ring binder?
No, not at all. Anyone can buy dark fiber off the three-ring binder, but it's just someone needs to put the equipment and light it.
Right, okay.
It's an anti-monopoly network in a way. It is meant to create a platform where anyone could provide internet access in a rural area. And it's not just used by carriers. You have some businesses that are more sophisticated and have their own network department use it to light up locations between different locations. It's used a lot by hospitals, which tend to have their own networking departments. But the primary use is carriers who put their equipment on it and use it to provide middle mile services and last mile services in some cases. But it isn't an all-in-one service. There was really nothing in rural Maine, and the first thing that was needed to lay down a foundation was the fiber itself. And the idea is if you put the fiber in, that would lower the barriers for carriers to provide access because the fiber was already there, but they had to make an investment themselves in the form of equipment. So the hope was very flexibly it would create a public-private partnership where the private sector would be worth it for them to do it because the cost had been lowered so much. But at the same time, they would have to put some skin in the game. And to give you a sense of the cost, it's per strand per mile per month in the neighborhood of $15 to $20 per strand per mile per month, which is maybe 50% to one-third of the rate that for commercial fiber. And in many of these places, there was no commercial fiber available, certainly not on an open access basis.
Right, because I think, like many states, Maine, you had a situation where, to the extent that there was fiber or high-capacity links, it was controlled largely by the incumbent telephone company that had historically served that area, which had been Verizon until they sold it off to Fairpoint, which was an unmitigated disaster, according to many of the consumers that I've talked to. Just in terms of the actual transfer, things have gotten a little bit better, but people are still pretty frustrated, and that's just to say that the incumbent then has little incentive to actually make that available to competitors.
Right. It was not available to competitors.
So anyway, that was the middle mile. I didn't want to get sort of too far down that rabbit hole. So you were involved in creating that project. You helped to make sure it got stimulus funding, and it's taken off. It's done very well. The main fiber company which operates it seems to be doing well. But you also have last mile experience. So just as a reminder to folks who maybe haven't been listening to all the back catalog of shows, what's your experience with last mile networks?
We started doing last mile networks fiber networks about 10 years ago, a little over that. And now we're like many companies. We're well in the transition off the copper network to the fiber network. We provide residential and business service, primarily business service, off of last mile networks. Some of those are in partnership with municipalities, and some of them are, I think, interesting, charismatic projects. But then I'm from Maine, so something like creating an island off the coast of the Maine where has universal gigabit broadband for everyone, I think is really neat. There's, a gigabit island is pretty cool.
Yeah, Islesboro, which we have done a couple of shows on, and I haven't been there, but I've glimpsed it from the shore. So I know that it's
really
beautiful.
Hope you get there sometime, because if I didn't have family on the mainland, boy, that's where I live. It's a neat community, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place. And there's just something really special about living on an island and the closeness you have with different people. And my expectation is now that there's really cheap gigabit access available to everyone, that it will attract young people who can have jobs where they can live anywhere and have the opportunity to raise a family in an island environment. I was delighted to be able to give my kids the experience of a Maine childhood, but I think an island childhood trumps that.
Well, speaking of Trump, whether it's Trump or Clinton, we're going to have a new administration come next year. And one of the things that people in the broadband world have been talking about is how to improve access. And sometime over the last year, I remember NTIA at a conference saying that they thought the smartest thing a new administration could do to spur better internet access would be to just build a lot more middle mile access, much like we invested in the BTOP program, the Broadband Technology Opportunities Program, as part of the stimulus investments. And I thought it's worth talking about because it raises my hackles a little bit. I've argued that middle mile investment is definitely necessary, although I think the benefits from it are less than have been expected. And my reading of it is basically that when you build a lot of middle mile, you get a little bit of last mile. So I guess I'm curious if we could just start with a sort of maybe empirical look. What has happened with the robust middle mile you have throughout Maine?
You can't have the last mile without the middle mile. So it is necessary, but it's certainly not sufficient. And to some extent, that's what we've seen in Maine. Certainly in the first few years, and it's starting to tick up now, but that thing was completed almost 5 years ago. And we have a number of communities that have really good broadband now. And some of these are really rural, remote communities in Maine where you have the best broadband in the state.
And that's mostly served by, I think, historic co-ops or local companies that are really rooted in the community, right?
Yeah, it's entirely small companies or the independent telephone companies, which are not co-ops, but it's all small companies, and it's either the independent telephone companies, which have really the best, much better coverage than the big incumbent. It's kind of like the bigger those independent telephone companies are, the worse their broadband is. And then a bunch of new entrants, such as Pioneer Broadband, up in Aroostook County. Almost all, in fact, I think all of that money, however, the last mile has been done with additional government subsidies, mostly from the state, and then from the Connect Me Authority. The Connect The state is the Connect Me Authority. Then there's the federal Connect America Fund. But it's a drop in the bucket. And we're getting to the point where the economics justify doing it with private money, but we're not there yet. And it's just that these are rural communities with lack of density, and the adoption rate is problematic. And the dynamic that's just something that is. There are two dynamics going on that seem potentially to make things better. One is adoption rate going up. So basically, people are less and less and less satisfied with their DSL and wireless-based broadband all the time. I mean, it really doesn't even meet. DSL really doesn't meet, and a lot of the rural wireless doesn't meet the definition of broadband anymore. And the definition of broadband, the bar is constantly being raised all the time. So that's going on. So more people are willing to switch to fiber. And at the same time, the costs are coming down somewhat in providing fiber as things get more efficient. So those things are going on, but it's a slow trend. And I think with nothing else happening, it's going to be a long time till that is completed. And there's many reasons to believe that there's a bunch of communities without some level of government support, which will never have sufficient networks. If you think about the power network, just fundamentally, the rural networks, the power network, the road network, the telephone network, all in rural areas, all required government support. And the economics are not changed enough by fiber, even though it's cheaper than copper. It's still too expensive in quite a few areas to do it. The payback is just not there. There's going to need to be government subsidy for the last mile.
And so if we accept that there's going to be government subsidy, I think the question then is how to target it. And one of the things that I've said, and you can certainly, I'm not asking you to just go along because it's my show. I love being challenged and being told where I'm wrong. Is that when you build robust middle mile, you are lowering the operating cost of a network. And so, if you think that building middle mile is going to change the equation on the last mile, you're missing an important point, which is the barrier to investing in the last mile is primarily a capital cost. It's not an operating cost. Now, operating cost is a barrier, but my argument has been that when you put a lot of money into last mile networks, then you create a business model for middle mile networks. But when you just build a lot of middle mile networks, you're not really creating a business model for last mile networks. What do you think about that?
I'm not sure I agree. First of all, the difference between capital and operating costs is ultimately just an accounting issue, and it's money out the door either way, and money that needs to be there. If you're starting up a network, operating costs in a way are capital costs because you're going to have to fund some losses in the early days, and you're going to need the capital to do that.
Right.
I really think middle mile is the foundation. And you need to do it first. But if you build a last mile network that, New Hampshire Fast Roads, there are government funded last mile networks that ended up, not working, and to a large extent not working because of the high cost of the middle mile. I mean, that's one example there. And I'm sure there's others, but there's one point I really want to make, is one of the dumbest things people do, and you see this constantly, is you build a middle mile network that's just a middle mile network and it's not a last mile network at the same time. That makes no sense. We have a conceptual tool dividing the network into middle and last mile, but fiber on the pole is fiber on the pole. And if you're running a middle mile network, build it so it can be used for a last mile network for all the places you pass. And you probably pass quite a few of them. Many of these rural areas, you're going to run the middle mile right down the highway, and that happens to be where all the business and most of a goodly part of the population is. So you start with a big win right there. You should never build fiber and not build it to serve every dwelling and building past. the incremental cost is so low compared to the cost of going back and redoing it. And you see people redoing it and paying massively for that all the time. So, I think ultimately, Chris, people are trying to come up with a half-assed solution that ends up doing nothing. There's no way that you're going to get out of having to subsidize both. And it will be easier ultimately to deal with the middle mile problem, the last mile problem, than the middle mile problem. And there's more of a, I think, more of a kind of conceptual role for the government in it, because the middle mile is massively shared infrastructure, is shared between multiple towns. I can see a day when a community can invest in itself. It's taken us a while to put together the models and tools because we're used to networks getting help from the federal government for power and telephone and roads and water, storms, wastewater, things like that. And the change in the world where all of a sudden, the federal government doesn't help people anymore, that we don't share those expenses amongst ourselves is a new one.
I think one of the challenges is that when these decisions are made in D.C. in particular, but also in the states and to a lesser extent in the cities, I think you have people saying, "Well, let's come up with a solution that doesn't upset anyone." And I think that's one of the things that you're definitely pushing back against. I mean, there's this sense, and I believe that one of the reasons that the stimulus program focused so much on middle mile is because it was less likely to upset incumbent operators. Nobody's axe was really being gored significantly.
And so you got regulatory capture going on big time. Well, I'm a Yankee Republican, and I believe in investments that pay for themselves. I mean, you should get more out than you put in when society invests. And I believe that rural broadband is one of those. I mean, ultimately, you build these, you're either going to end up dealing with a depopulated rural area, or you're going to end up supporting a failing economy, or you can do this investment and create economic growth there that spins up everything, because the rural areas depend on the urban areas, and if it's farming or natural resources, then the urban areas depend on the rural areas too. But this is an investment that society can make that makes economic sense.
I think so. This raises an interesting question. I'm just curious to get your reaction to it, which is to say that you can actually do this investment in a very poor way, though, too, which is something that I'm afraid we're doing in Minnesota, which is to say we're going to invest in rural fiber, but only in areas that have nothing. Which is to say that if you have a county and you have a population center that has poor DSL, slow cable, we're going to invest in fiber all around that and not allow any government subsidized competition inside of that area. And our fear is that then you actually are going to be pulling apart those main streets. Is that a dynamic that you would foresee?
I would think so. I mean, the danger of saying bad wireless and bad DSL means you can't have good broadband, the broadband that's necessary for economic growth and survival of the community, because young people don't stay where all they have is DSL. That's just not good enough to be part of today's economy and society. And if you think it's bad now, just wait for a year or two. I mean, there's so much fiber being built in urban areas. It's going to become the economic norm, and rural areas are really going to take it in this neck. I have heard from real estate agents, the first question that people ask is, what's the broadband like here? They assume that it's got clean water, and they assume that it's got power. But broadband is becoming just as important. I'm not quite sure what pointed part Main Street means, which I think is what you said. But I think if you go to a community and say availability of DSL and older wireless broadband means that you are not eligible for government subsidies to build good broadband, is really going to hurt a lot of places.
what I had in mind when I was saying that is that you have a situation in which businesses and people who live in those towns are thinking to themselves, if I stay here, I can pay often more for much slower, less reliable service, or I move 10 miles away into the country.
Will businesses and people over time make the decision to move out of communities? And the answer is absolutely yes. And you see that all over the place. And we have a real problem in Maine with that problem. And it's certainly not the only and probably not the major, but it's a definite component. I think as a component, the importance of it will rise over time. Just think of what it's going to be like in a few years. Most people, they don't even think a few years out. And, you're just not, communities are not going to be able to participate fully in the economy. It's going to be a real problem. Businesses won't come there. Business will relocate, and the same is true for individuals.
And I think one of the things, when it comes to smaller rural cities, I think Maine's experience, not way up in the North Country, but when you're in sort of, just the normal areas in between Portland and Augusta or Bangor and whatnot, they're pretty similar to our Minnesota, greater Minnesota cities. Yeah. And I think, the idea that you would take that population that lives, the small population aggregations that you have, and then you disperse them. It's one thing if they move to Portland or to Bangor. It's another thing if they move 15 miles away and you're trying to figure out, how do we build roads in this low density area? How do we build water systems? How do we take care of all that? We want people to be aggregating in those areas.
I hadn't thought of that before, but it's a way of Maine is from time to time over the last 5 decades suffered from what we call sprawl, which brings a lot of those problems. And yes, this could be something if you don't provide good broadband in the population centers and do provide it in the rural areas. Of course, people are going to move, and it's going to drive sprawl.
Well, let's touch on one final thing before we run out of time. Let's talk about cherry picking, which is when I first started researching what happens when you build robust middle mile. I came across the Alberta SuperNet, which was built almost 20 years ago. Now it started being built, and they connected over 400 population centers in Alberta, which tells you that they're talking about a population center being anywhere like 50 people hanging out or more. And they opened it up in such a pricing mechanism that their goal was to spur last mile investment by anyone. And when I talked with them 5 or 6 years ago, and things might have changed since then, they said that one of the big results that they saw was basically cherry picking, in that people would go to the Alberta SuperNet point of presence and they'd throw up some wireless, or they would do some basic investment, and they would just try to get a few customers, as many as they could, and then they would be done, and they wouldn't invest further, which I think is makes universal service even more expensive than it otherwise would be. How do you build a middle mile to make sure that you're not encouraging that sort of cherry picking?
First of all, you've hit on a really important problem. Second of all, the reason it's so hard is, I think it's going to be so prevalent, is it's hard to avoid, and I think it's just to some extent an economic reality. What is the mechanism for getting people, carriers, to serve people that aren't economic? We tend to be future-oriented here, definitely to a fault. There's some things you can do. First of all, technically, if you extend the network to serve those few customers around the middle mile, there ought to be some mechanism, and we're just doing it with private money because the cost is not that much, but the benefit is so great, to build it in such a way that if you build a mile off the middle mile, you plan to serve everyone that's 2 miles out and 3 miles out and 5 miles out. So you design your network in such a way that you expect to extend it ultimately to do universal service. So that's really important. I think the best way from a societal standpoint to deal with this is to come up with targeted subsidies that would vary on a much finer grain than we've had in the past, for providing service outside of to the people who wouldn't be cherry picked because they're not economic. And what we're looking at and working with, there's this really good, if anyone out there who's listening is planning to or building a fiber system, you ought to look at a new company. Well, the company isn't new, the software is new. It's called Vetro. It's put out by a company called MVP Solutions. And the idea is to use big data to figure out exactly how much it would cost to extend the network to additional locations, be it a neighborhood or an individual house or a road or something like that. And that can be updated dynamically as your network grows. I'm a computer scientist, and many of the most successful computer science theories come from nature. And if you look at the way that a plant grows, the way that a tree grows, where you start out with a spur, a leafing spur, and that grows into a branch, and then other branches grow off of that. You could use software like this to build a network in the same fashion, so it grows organically. Your costs are updated as the network grows, and a location gets closer to the network. The cost of extending service goes down, and you could target subsidies in a bidder fashion, where for a given location, 25% subsidy on the cost of construction, and another needs 50%, and there may be some rural areas that need 100%. And as the network grows, different network providers can bid on that. But bottom line is cherry picking is shaping the world. I mean, if you think about it right now, Google and everybody's investing their fiber dollars in the wealthy, dynamic southern cities and or a few wealthy, dynamic northern cities, but everywhere else is not getting that. Over time, as the best investments become not available, people go for things that are more marginal. But this cherry picking is shaping the network we have today and will into the future. And
right. Well, I think to some extent that was maybe one of the goals of the Connect America Fund, although I think perhaps outweighed by their generosity to the incumbents. The idea of the reverse auctions.
There's so much regulatory capture. You know this. And you just can't do something without taking care of the big boys. And it's unfortunate. A and B, this is what I'm talking about is a technology solution to it, really harnessing big data and being a more dynamic system. Governments aren't very good at technology, and they tend to be behind the curve. And so, at some point, hopefully it'll get to this point, and then you got to watch out pay a lot of attention to the solution to make sure there isn't regulatory capture involved in that, so you don't end up with the result you expect. But conceptually, I think it's a topic that's worth a lot of exploration. So you should get a group of us together and we should talk about it.
Great. Well, we'll keep that in mind for a future show. I like that idea. Coming soon to a podcast feed near you.
It's cherry picking. It's going to be big.
Thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about middle mile versus last mile.
Enjoyed the discussion.
That was Chris and Fletcher Kittredge discussing last mile versus middle mile to expand internet access. We have transcripts for this and other Community Broadband Bits podcasts available at muninetworks.org/broadbandbits. Email us with your ideas for the show at podcast@muninetworks.org. Follow Chris on Twitter. His handle is @CommunityNets. Follow muninetworks.org stories on Twitter. The handle is @muninetworks.org. Thank you to the group Roller Genoa for their song Safe and Warm in Hunter's Arms, licensed through Creative Commons. And thank you for listening to episode 214 of the Community Broadband Bits podcast.